Welcome to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I'm your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. You can find show notes, how to contact me, sign up for our mailing list, and how to support the History of the Papacy by going to our website, a2zhistorypage.com. Two great ways to support the History of the Papacy are leaving your ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts or your podcatcher of choice. And another really great way to support the History of the Papacy is by going and joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/History of the Papacy. Your support on Patreon goes a long way to help keep the History of the Papacy sustainable for a long time in the future. There are 4 tiers of support on Patreon: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. Each of these tiers represents one of the traditional patriarchates of early Christianity. There are many great benefits to you for supporting the show on Patreon. You will receive early and advertisement-free content, bonus episodes, monthly book drawings, and most importantly, you will be included on the History of the Papacy diptychs. In traditional Christianity, the diptychs are the lists of bishops commemorated in order of their precedence. The sooner you sign up on Patreon, the higher you'll be on the lists of the History of the Papacy patrons. Now let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Roberto, Joran, William B., Brian, Christina, Sarah, William H., Augustus, Keanu, and Judy at the Alexandria level. We have Doppo, Paul, Justin, Lana, John, Steve, and Alex, all of whom are magnificent at the Constantinople level and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome. We have Peter the Great, Frederick the Great, Geoffrey the Great, and Jim the Great. And with that, here is the next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. All right, Gary, what do you think? Let's jump into the Christianization of the Septuagint. That's a really interesting topic because, as we've been talking about, the Septuagint was a Second Temple Jewish document, but it gets completely Christianized, you could almost say. It really, and as a matter of fact, it really was. It got taken up by the Christians almost completely.
Indeed. I mean, very few people rejected the Old Testament, did they?
Yeah, and well, so, you know, we're also seeing that the Jews and the split between Christians and Jews, the rabbinical Jews are fairly much rejecting the Septuagint at the same time that the Christians are embracing it. And so the early Christians were very partial to the Septuagint. And I think it's worth mentioning this quote again, even though we had mentioned it earlier, the Septuagint as Christian Scripture by Martin Hengel. It's really appropriate for this section. He said the Septuagint, although itself consisting of a collection of Jewish documents, wishes to be a Christian book. And I think that's such a powerful quote because so many things in the Septuagint, of the way it's translated, the Christians just took and ran with it. Most early Christians accepted the Old Testament as 100% as sacred scripture, except for those Marcionites that always keep popping up.
Marcionites, evil.
And we won't get into everything of why they rejected the Old Testament, but we can say that the vast majority of Christians did accept the Old Testament, and really the Old Testament that they were accepting was the Septuagint. Now, you might say that this is just a product of Christianity being so influenced by the Greco-Roman culture that seems to be the default, is that Christianity split away from Judaism because it became so Greco-Romanized. But there's just not a lot of evidence for that they were accepting and bringing in pagan religious customs. Early Christianity was a very much a Second Temple Jewish phenomenon, from everything that I've seen, at least.
Well, certainly from what I've seen. I mean, it seems to me if rabbinical Judaism had never got off the ground, Christianity looks like what it would have become. With all of the huge ideas bubbling around in the Second Temple period, Christianity is a perfectly natural development of that.
Now, and if we start to look at the individual texts, like if we take the most Jewish of the Gospels, the Gospel of Matthew, even he primarily quotes the Septuagint, and the other books, it's not even close. They're way, way, way off the charts as percentage wise of where their quotes are coming from. Sometimes the early or proto Masoretic text is quoted, but those cases are pretty rare. Early Christians made the claim that they were the true inheritors of Moses because they were the ones who accepted the Septuagint. The Jews, which in this case we would be talking about the rabbinical Jews, they rejected the Septuagint, which was obviously, according to the Christians, divinely inspired. So they couldn't be the original inheritors of Moses. That's the apologetics that are going on at that point. So I think that shows how ingrained that the Septuagint was in at least that particular strain coming out of Second Temple Judaism. It wasn't just like, oh, we're going to take the Septuagint because it's different and Greeky. Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great podcasts like Mark Vinet's History of North America podcast. Go over to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. And now a quick word from our sponsors.
That's the point. You know, I've often wondered, given that we believe that the authors of the Gospels were all Palestinian Jews, but their documents are written in Greek, and as you say, they quote from the Greek Septuagint when they have to. Well, how likely is it that fishermen, etc., knew Greek? I mean, did these guys employ scribes? Did they? I mean, I can't see either Matthew. Well, let's go to the simplest one, say Mark, who was meant to be a disciple of Peter, if I remember correctly. I can't see him actually, knowing much Hebrew, really, for a start, or being able to read or write. And yet somehow his name gets attached to a Greek gospel. I find that whole thing a bit of a mystery.
I find it strange, too, with Mark, as I've read that his Greek is clunky.
Yeah.
How he always starts with every sentence with "and." Yeah. Which I kind of fell into that trap myself, but at least in speaking, but I certainly wouldn't do that in writing. So I think you could say that he's maybe writing the way he speaks. So is he somebody who didn't know the high status Greek of the day, but he knew how to write? That seems kind of strange.
You know, what you've just described sounds like someone dictating something.
And then the person who's scribing it's taking it word for word. Yeah,
he's taking it word for word. He is making a transcript.
Yeah. But then do you think that a paid scribe, wouldn't want to basically fix it up, copy edit it?
You'd think so, wouldn't you? I mean, the scribes must have been some of, if not the most highly educated people in the region, even just because they could read and write. And given that they would also be professional writers, they must have been really pretty smart. I know that there's a whole bunch of weird questions around the Gospels and their Greekness and why they're written in Greek and how the supposed authors, it's just so unlikely that they were literate to start off with in any language, let alone Greek.
Yeah, just to go back to Mark, I think you could, just as from my experience of teaching reading and writing, I think you could take it in a way of he was scribing it, like you said, that he had a writer writing it and taking an actual transcription, which he could have been, hey, I'm paying for it. You're going to write down what I said.
That's a good point.
Or it's that maybe he was not very educated in Greek, but learned enough to write himself. And I don't know enough, and I don't know how much of the type of scholarship on this would be even accessible to laymen such as ourselves, of the scribal tradition of what were scribes actually doing. Like Paul even says it in one of his letters that he's talking to his scribe. How much is it in that process? Would Paul have written anything himself, like physically written anything himself? And then in that process, how much was the scribe editing for content and editing for grammar, punctuation, and that sort of thing?
Yeah. That's an excellent question. Well, I think we can say with pretty much confidence, Paul hardly wrote anything, because in one letter at the end, he actually says, blah, 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 and so I say, by my own hand. He makes a point of saying, yes, I've just written this sentence. Well, I mean, Paul was a traveling tent maker, leather worker. Where did he get the money to pay for a scribe? Maybe. Sorry.
Especially after he takes up and he's a preacher, essentially, a traveling theologian. Where's he getting his money from? But then wasn't he from a rich family? Some people think that he was. That's why he had Roman citizenship.
Actually, that's a good point. I mean, if Paul was a trust fund kid,
essentially,
basically, that would explain why he could afford to go traveling and picking up the odd job and afford scribes and that sort of thing. And yes, the fact of his Roman citizenship, which no one's ever actually bothered to explain how. No one knows how he got it.
I don't know if this is a completely wild theory, but I had read someplace that Paul in Cilicia and Tarsus, for some reason, I can't remember, the Jews there had gotten Roman citizenship for maybe supporting the Romans in a revolt or something against the local client king or something like that. I wish I remembered where I read that it had gone back more than a generation before Paul. It might have been maybe his grandparents' era. Something had happened in that particular corner of Anatolia that had given all of the Jews in that area Roman citizenship as kind of a reward for something.
That's interesting. Now, if we go back to Paul's grandparents, that would probably place it in the time of Pompey, when Pompey was marching through the east and transforming the whole area into Roman provinces. So, yeah, it's entirely possible that there was some sort of minor. The locals were saying, no, we're not really keen on being Romans, guys. And the Jews thought, okay, maybe quite a good idea.
Well, is that the area incredible where that local leader, that local king, he took little doses of poison to inoculate himself, and then by the end, when the Romans were just about to kill him, he couldn't take enough poison to kill himself. It was something with an M.
Mithridates.
Yes, that's it.
Mithridates, that's the nth.
Yeah, I think it was about it. It may have been. For some reason, I'm thinking his kingdom might have been a little north of there.
What's coming into my head is that the kingdom was sort of in the center of modern Turkey, so not on the coast. Yeah,
but that's something. That's something to think about. And then if Paul is educated, again, if you're educated, you must be coming from some sort of wealth, or something more than poor, at least. And there really wasn't much in between.
Yeah. I mean, Paul's education, I think, would have been probably roughly the equivalent of a university education today, at a time when hardly anyone had such an education. What a pity Paul didn't write something about his family.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah. Sorry, I was just thinking, now that would be a great idea for a forged letter.
That's pseudo-epigraphical.
That's right. Paul's first letter to the Spartans.
And he gives the background story. Let me tell you a little bit about myself.
Yeah, that letter would be wonderful to find.
But if somebody's writing fan fiction out there, that could be a good thing to write about. I think all this talk gets us back to the point. And here's another piece of pure speculation. I wonder if somebody who's scribing the letter, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, etc., if they're telling this to a scribe, oh, make reference to this thing that was in this letter of the Old Testament or this book of the Old Testament. If they're not giving the full quote, then in the scribe, if they have to go back to the source document, is it possible that all of the educated scribes all they had was the Septuagint?
Good question.
That's one that we could pose to somebody. I think that if it's the second level, your boss says that, oh, we need reference to X, Y, and Z in the letter, or in a college paper, the professor tells his research assistant, and they have a couple of different versions of the text to go to, they might automatically go to the one they're more comfortable with. I'm thinking even maybe the second generation, like take it in a modern case where maybe a lot of the graduate students are from China and they wind up using a Chinese translation of something that's just more accessible to them. I don't know. That's wild speculation, but that does get us back to the point that there's a lot of layers built into here that I think we'll never know precisely, because they're never going to find a text that will explain this. This is how we wrote this, and this is why I chose this sort of citation method. I think that in this point too, before we move on completely into the Christian use of the Septuagint, we should make the distinction between Christian and Jew, and it's a lot more complicated than the standard idea of there first being Jews and then there being Christians as the daughter religion. There was Second Temple Judaism, which had a variety of sects so different that in many ways they were really in their core beliefs, they could be considered different religions, even though they were all Jews. Proto-rabbinical Judaism and Christianity both evolved from that tradition. The idea that the Septuagint was a Christian document waiting for Christianity is really important. There was a tradition in Second Temple Judaism, even before the birth of Christ, that there was many flavors that the upcoming Christian religion could tap into. And there were parts of the Septuagint, even though it was translated upwards to 200 years before the birth of Jesus, that sound very Christian, even reading them completely in a vacuum. And then there was also a lot of Alexandrian and Egyptian Jewish thinkers like Philo that really sounded quite Christian themselves, even though Philo died right around the time that Jesus was born. There's a famous book, Justin Martyr's Dialogue with Trypho, and Trypho was a Jew, and they don't know if he may have been a straw man that Justin Martyr created, or it could have been a real guy, but it doesn't really matter because he really is kind of arguing with the prototypical or an archetypal opinion. And Trypho complained about Christians using the Septuagint. And then Justin responds that the Jews were apostate for editing out pro-Christian elements. I think that that's such an interesting apologetic line, that you have very, very early Christians and then very, very early proto-rabbinical Jews. And the argument is, well, you edited this out of the Septuagint, or you don't have it in your Masoretic text, which it might have never been in the Masoretic text in the first place, if we're saying that they might be pulling from different sources. But they're saying that the early Christians are saying that said that the early Jews were the inauthentic ones. I think that that's a really interesting quote and an interesting thing to think about in the context of the Septuagint.
Yeah, I can see the general Jewish reaction to that. It would have to be a case of, you have got to be kidding me. You have got to be kidding me.
And I would think that that sort of conversation probably didn't go on very long, because I think they were coming at it. You don't argue with somebody who you're completely disagreeing with, because you don't get anywhere with it.
That's true. If you've got zero common ground, there's no point arguing, is there?
Especially, I think, in the academic realm and the theological realm. I mean, it's not as easy to say that the separation went down completely at any point up until maybe the 300s and the 400s in the practical sense, because you still had Christians who were celebrating Passover on the 14th of Nisan. You had Jews sometimes going to churches and Christians sometimes going to a church and then going to a synagogue. So you had a lot of double dipping and overlap for a long time after this of Justin Martyr's time.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we actually have positive evidence for this. There's one, I think it's maybe John Chrysostom, the early church father. We have a sermon of his which specifically castigates Christians for going to synagogues. So we don't have to make any suppositions about that. We know that.
And then at the Dura Europa, the church gets more attention, but there was also a synagogue down the street, and that had iconography and all sorts of elements to it that would be absolutely forbidden later on when Judaism, rabbinical Judaism, became so aniconic. Is that the right word? I think so. So against images, but all over, they're finding all the time synagogues that had not just geometric patterns or vague patterns of things, biblical stories in mosaic form and frescoes. So the blending and the line was becoming more stark at the high level, but it took a little while for it to seep into I guess you might call it the day-to-day life.
Yeah. I've seen some of those synagogue mosaics. They're really quite pretty. And I remember there's one where most of the mosaic, it has some Jewish symbols around the edges, menorahs and that sort of stuff. But the center of the mosaic is Zeus Helios.
Yeah.
Driving the sun chariot. Okay. So
I've always found it interesting too, the Dura Europa synagogue not getting as much attention, but it was very high rent. The mosaics and the art were very, very high quality. The church had a lot of art in it, but it was not at the highest quality. Like maybe it was somebody's brother-in-law gave him a deal on that, where on the others, just a couple of streets down, the synagogue was very high end.
Yeah. I wonder if pagan patrons had much input into that, because we know that a lot of pagans, particularly Roman women, paid for the building of synagogues. I'm wondering in some cases it was a case of, she's asked us to put this big mosaic of Zeus. And one rabbi turns to the other one rabbi and says, really? And they agree, yeah, okay. Not really our thing, but it's your money, love. So have what you want.
We'll go with it. Yeah, the patron gets a lot of say in how things get done.
That's right. It'd be like, I suppose, the equivalent of an advertising deal.
Now let's move into our final phase here of the Christian use of the Septuagint. Again, I'll quote Martin Hengel, and the Septuagint is Christian scripture. Quote, "First Clement demonstrates more clearly than any other document from the New Testament period how the piety, ethos, and liturgy of diaspora Judaism could be adopted almost seamlessly by Christian communities." And that's another one where, I mean, I have so many questions about, and I think there's so many things you can say for and against this, that I think it's very likely possible that Christianity caught fire so quickly because it lined up pretty closely to a lot of diaspora Judaism, especially in the Hellenistic world.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
But then on the other hand, when people listen to your podcast and they hear about Keto's war, we also learn that a lot of diaspora Jews were killed during Bar Kokhba and Keto's war.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So you might ask the question, was it that maybe changed the demographic, that it was easier to make inroads into the diaspora Jews because a lot of the diaspora Jews had died, and it's almost apocalyptic in that way, if it's as nearly as apocalyptic as the sources say. Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors.
I think I remember reading that after the Kittos War, Egypt was basically depopulated of Jews. Because they caused a lot of damage in Egypt, and I think they fled back to Judea. So given that Alexandria had been the great nexus where Hellenism met Judaism, and the Kittos War is around about 120, I think, something like that, that nexus would have been destroyed. No, I don't know where I was going with it.
What's strange, though, is that at least by the sources, I believe there was a fairly significant Jewish population by the 4th century because Cyril of Alexandria wrote against them, and there was fights between the Jews and the Christians, and I can't remember what they were called. They were a kind of proto monks who, at least in the common, if you look at some of the anti-Christian apologetics, they said that these monks would go and raid into the Jewish sections and kill everybody, but other scholars say that didn't happen. But I mean, that assumes then that there was maybe it had become repopulated later.
I definitely read somewhere, yes. Jews moved back into Egypt and Alexandria a couple of generations. I think maybe 150 years they slowly came back. So that would be by about the year, by the late 200s, they would have been back in Egypt.
All right, that's very interesting. As we've been saying, almost all references to the Old Testament in the New Testament come from the Septuagint. Of about the 160 Old Testament references in the New Testament, the vast majority are from the Septuagint, with the Gospel of Matthew being the least, but still a lot. Paul almost exclusively used the Septuagint as a source document. Paul knew Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic, and Latin, but he used the Greek text. Paul often has been criticized for misquoting the Hebrew text, but that is based on the Masoretic text, which has changed slightly. But Paul almost always quotes the Septuagint accurately. In some cases, he paraphrases the prophets, but he does so in a way that's really consistent with Greek literary norms of how another text is referenced.
Right.
One of the criticisms of Paul is that when he quotes something, he doesn't block quote it, you might say. He summarizes it, but he places it in there like a quote. And so what some scholars think is that he's just either misquoting, or in some way things are getting lost in translation. But it also, I've read that it was a technique, a literary technique, that you summarize the text, but then still put it in a quote.
Yeah.
And we'll never solve this because, I mean, there's so much ink has been spilled on this. And I mean, that's a dissertation for another lifetime.
Yeah. It's a pity neither of us can speak Greek or Latin, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Again, another lifetime.
Yeah.
A lot of words and concepts that enter the New Testament come from the Septuagint. The New Testament, the actual word itself, comes from a Septuagint translation of the term Hebrew covenant. Gospel, evangelion, comes from the Septuagint, and its original use of evangelium was a term for an official news from the king or the emperor. Then Kyrios, or Kyrios, as Lord, Christos as the anointed one. Christianity really made use of the Psalms too, especially liturgically. Psalms are poems or songs from a Greek word, psalm, meaning song sung to a harp. So those particular, the Psalms, I guess, were always intended to never be read, but to be sung and sung to music, which is interesting. The Hebrew word that was used in the Psalms was talhim, which means a song of praise, which that works too.
Yeah.
Of everything from the Old Testament or the Hebrew text, again, apologies to anybody out there who doesn't like Old Testament versus Hebrew text or any other term. We'll use the Old Testament as a convenience. The Psalms are the most quoted of those Old Testament texts in the New Testament. And it's they're obviously very difficult to translate because they are poetry and something that was particularly set to music. Then just one more thing that leads us into our last phase is the early Christians were much more inclusive or willing to use a diversity of text, and definitely much, much more so than proto-rabbinical Jews, where the proto-rabbinical Jews were really going on a spectrum. If we're looking at openness of canon to a completely closed canon, the rabbinical Jews are going way more towards a set, closed canon. The early Christians, I mean, in some cases, anything could make it in there and be used. And even to this day, the Ethiopian Orthodox, where if it's pretty much anything was that you could think of is in their canon.
Pretty much. I mean, I'm surprised they don't have a few IKEA manuals in it.
That will definitely change. And even within Christianity, the push was to get more and more towards a canon. But like we said, Ethiopian Orthodox, much to this day, maximalists with IKEA catalogs and instruction manuals. It's kind of like your junk drawer where you put all the menus. That's their canon, where Protestants are much more minimalist on that front.
Following Martin Luther, Protestants basically accepted a minimalist Hebrew canon. So a lot of the books that were in the Greek Septuagint were thrown out. I'm trying to think of them. I always get Ruth and Judith confused. No, Ruth is in, Judith got thrown out.
Tobit?
Tobit. Oh, yeah, the fish man. Because there's a story about scales and fish curing them or something. Yeah, Tobit. And I think there's about 5 or 6 others.
Yeah, I think chunks of Daniel.
Oh, yes, that's true.
And then they get mixed and matched in different ways. And that really leads us very well into the next part of Jerome and Origen, trying to find out the original Bible. I think Origen and Jerome I never really put them together before doing this, but I think in a lot of ways they fit together very well because they're very similar in a lot of ways and they're very different in a lot of ways. Origen is your classic Greek guy. He's really rooted in the Hellenistic culture of Egypt and then the Middle East, whereas Jerome's the prototypical Latin, but then he has a grounding in Middle Eastern Hellenistic culture too, and there's a lot of crossover between the two. This is just the tip of the iceberg on the Septuagint. Keep your ears out and your podcatchers caught up for the next episode as Garry and I delve into even more fascinating issues on this most incredible and really important document in Christian history. Talk to you next time.